Okay. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us on a Friday morning. Goodness, before the weekend. My name is Jonathan McMillan, and I'm heading up our trade and tariffs response team in Enterprise Ireland. Delighted that you can join us this morning. This is our latest webinar that we're doing in terms of all the changes that are happening in the trading environment, and in particular are the uncertainty that you as our clients are having to face. We're delighted to partner with two of our very good partners this morning for this webinar, Board BIA, and I'll introduce Kieran just in a second, and also BDO. So I mentioned we're partnering this morning with Board BIA, and I'm delighted to welcome Kieran Gallagher, who is the regional manager for the US market and also for Europe. Kieran, do you want to just say hello to the participants?
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks, Jonathan and your team, for organizing this. As you said, I'm regional manager for Board BIA in the US and Europe, and I oversee the Board BIA tariff response services. And I do think the timing of today's webinar is really critical, even though there's still a lot of uncertainty out there. And I think there's a great temptation to take a wait and see approach. I think this is the time that we should, in fact, be kind of preparing and scenario planning for whatever may come down the line. And it's something that we've heard as well, even from our US customers, that maybe a reluctance to engage in those really difficult conversations at times about what different scenarios might look like. But that doesn't mean that the Irish companies shouldn't be taking this time to work out what our response could be in the different circumstances. So I think the timing of this is really positive. And looking forward to working with you more closely going forward. And then I just say to the all, in addition to the services that you'll be talking about today, Jonathan, just to remind companies as well that there's more information available at the Board BIA website too. And we've set up an email, tariffs@boardbia.ie, for any company that would like more information. So over to you again.
Fantastic. Thanks a million, Kieran. And yeah, we'll maybe put that into the chat. If you want to put it in there, we'll make sure that Kate posts your email address.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll do.
So as I mentioned, this is our latest webinar in a mini series that we've been organizing. We had one yesterday all about managing finances. We have done about pricing and contracts, and we also did one with the Flint Group looking at what might be coming down the line. But we're delighted this morning to partner with Carol Lynch, who many of you will know already, with BDO. Carol is tax partner in BDO and also heads up their customs and international trade services team. Carol, it seems like months ago that you helped us kick this all off whenever we first started looking at what might be coming down the line. With the timing, as Kieran mentions, is really important. There's some things that we're going to talk about this morning. I'm going to hand over to Carol now to do a presentation. Please use the chat function to put any questions in, and we'll come back to those at the end to answer those specific questions. So over to you, Carol. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everybody. So I think to follow up on what Jonathan and Kieran were saying, this is the time to prepare and I suppose be prepared for what's coming down the line, possibly on July the 9th. And so what I'm going to go do today is go through where do we stand right now, what are the tariffs that are on the table, and what are my recommendations for everybody in terms of planning ahead and using this period to be prepared for the worst case in the event that that happens. So we start just, I'm not going to go through the whole background to what's the current position in the States, but as we know, the focus for President Trump is on tariffs and addressing trade deficits, and unfortunately Ireland has come on the firing line for that. Also, he's identified unfair trade practices, which includes VAT, even though that is kind of applicable to everybody, and essentially promoting American interests in order to encourage businesses to set up in the US. So as a result of that, where has that left us in terms of tariffs? Now, these tariffs, there's two types of tariffs being imposed. One are the reciprocal Liberation Day tariffs, which the courts have held in the US, federal court held the other day, were invalid. Now, notwithstanding that, President Trump has also been allowed the time to continue to implement those tariffs while the US government appeal is ongoing. So that's added further uncertainty for companies who are faced with paying these tariffs at the point of import, notwithstanding that the federal authorities have said the federal court has said that they are illegal. But as they're under appeal and as the government is allowed to implement them, they continue. So very important to keep records of your import documents at the moment. And if you, which you will be, you're paying your 10% customs duty on import into the US, make sure you have access to those records from your brokers and have your copies of your import declarations and the copies of the duties paid in the event these are ultimately held to be invalid and duties have to be refunded. So again, that not only from from last week on when the federal court ruled, but from the 5th of April when these were implemented. So a good thing to do right now, as a very kind of starting point, is to make sure that if you have been exporting to the US, that you have copies of all your import entries from your brokers over there, and you have a file ready to go in the event that those duties are to be refunded. Currently, those duties sit at 25% for Canada and Mexico, exceptions for what's called US CMA originating, which are goods which originate in Canada or originate in Mexico and are imported into the US under what's called the NAFTA, well, what was the NAFTA free trade agreement, now the US, Canada, Mexico free trade agreement. Then we have 30% tariffs on China. They, as we know, will have gone from 20%, and then about 2 weeks ago, I think we were about 145, and now they're back at 30 with exclusions for semiconductors and consumers. And then it's probably most interest to everybody here, the 10% base rate on European originating products being shipped into the US and UK originating products as well. And those rates came into effect on 5th of April, were due to increase for Europe to 20% on the 9th of April. Were put on pause and are on pause at the moment until the 9th of July. So that's why we're saying now is the right time to prepare. If this negotiations between the EU and the US are not successful, then those 20% duty rates at minimum will hit in on the 9th of July. And as you may know, President Trump also threatened a potential 50% tariff on European products over last weekend. So we're talking about a 20% minimum base there. 10% though for the UK, assuming that the trade agreement that is being negotiated between between the UK and the US is successful and that continues. The UK have seen an exclusion for steel products as part of that, but that trade agreement has not been finalized as yet. Then you have the the tariffs product specific categories. Again, probably not a huge relevance to everybody here, but 50% now on steel and aluminium and derivatives. Then there's investigations into copper and lumber, 25% tariffs on automobiles and parts, and then other Section 232 investigations into pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and aircraft, jet engines and parts. Those have not been struck down, those are still valid. So even if the reciprocal Liberation Day tariffs are held ultimately to be invalid and illegal, then expect more of these sector-specific Section 232 tariffs. I think what we have seen clearly is that tariffs are being used by President Trump as a negotiating tool. He very much likes to use tariffs, so there is no indication of this turmoil, I suppose, going away in the near future. Now, the unfortunate part for companies, of course, is where does that leave you in planning? And that is why I think myself, Borbia and Pres Ireland are all saying to everybody in this current situation, while we might hope for the best, that everything will work out and agreements will be reached, you have to plan for the worst because there is no real indication that these tariffs are ever going to go away. Along with the US trade tariffs, so that's you're an exporter, you're exporting into the US, and you're going to be hit with tariffs as an Irish exporter of 10% right now, potentially going to 20% next July. That's if the trade talks break down. But the 10%, and again, nobody knows this for certain, but the 10% base minimum tariff is really projected to stay in place. All the indications from the US authorities is that that 10% is here for the foreseeable. And really what's under dispute is whether that will go to 20 or 50%. In the reverse, the EU will put on tariffs if, again, the talks break down. At present, the current position is the EU is in the negotiation phase. There was a meeting yesterday between the EU and the US trade negotiators. Both sides, and I think particularly the EU side, are looking to see if there's a way to minimize the tariffs. Will negotiations succeed in terms of the EU buying more goods from the US? There's talk of a 0-0 trade deal on industrial products, and not on food products, but on industrial products. So all that happening and under negotiation at the moment. While those negotiations take place, the EU's retaliatory tariffs, which we look at in a moment, are paused until the 9th of July. So those two retaliatory tariff lists have been drawn up by the EU. One is in a regulation format and literally ready to go. One is in a consultation format until the 10th of June. And we're going to look at both of those separately in terms of how they would impact on food products and where you will find them to make sure that your products are, to check if your products are or are not on the list. The EU then is also increasing trade agreements. We're going to talk about that, use of trade agreements as an alternative to exporting to the US or as an addition to exporting to the US. Particularly looking at, for example, the Canadian trade agreement. There's a lot of work going on between the EU and Canada in terms of building trade relationships there. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then there's also WTO dispute settlements. While there are challenges to the tariffs at WTO level, they take years to work out, and the WTO doesn't really have the teeth used to with the US pulling out for the most part. So I wouldn't be heavily reliant on that. So let's look at the two lists. So first of all, we have the list of the 14th of April, and that was introduced to bring in 21 billion in retaliatory tariffs with an average 25% duty. This is again suspended on the 14th of July, and it includes things like steel and aluminium, clothing, makeup, maize, wheat, motorcycles. So a lot of, if anybody can remember the 2018 trade war with the US, a lot of similar products. The list of 8th of May is much broader. There's about 1,500 items on that list, and it is to target 95 billion in retaliatory tariffs. So significant increase on the original list. It's covering a broad range of industrial and agricultural products such as wine, fish, chemicals, and food products. So this is certainly one to look at. There'll also be restrictions on exports of steel and scrap, steel, scrap and chemicals. And that list, as I said, is open until the 10th of June. So where do you find those lists? And I can circulate this page after the session. The 14th of April list is in here. So if we look into that, you get into the Eurolex, and then you just go into the English PDF, and you'll get your list here. So I was looking earlier at the type of products involved, and I've got actually a summary later coming up, but you'll see that this is quite a long list of products. And what you need to do here is check, are your tariff classifications of anything you import from the US on this list? So we can see, for example, a lot of 1704 here, which is sugar confectionery. A lot of, we look at O2, we're down into the agricultural base, all the agricultural products tend to be in chapter 1 to 24. So that's that list there. We'll take a look about that again in just a minute. And then the second list is here, 8th of May list. And again, going into your download, open file. And again, second list you need to check to also see anything that you import at the moment from the US, are they on this list? Now, this list hasn't been finalized. It's still open for consultation until 10th of June. So the first thing to do with the second list is check, are any of the materials that you import on this list? And if they are, lodge your position with the European Union through that portal I just showed you. So here is I'm not going to go through all these, but again, significant list of products and a lot more food products based on this list. So absolutely critical to start working your way through those. So I said I'll send those around after the session. So how are we looking at, what are we looking at in terms of planning? At the moment, we have the biggest problem that most clients are facing at the moment is the uncertainty, and Jonathan referred to this as to Kieran earlier. So the problem is, how do you plan for duty impact in an uncertain world when you're not absolutely certain of what those duties are going to be? What you must do is say, I have a deadline of 9th of July. I know I'm going to be more than likely 70% probability hit with a 10% going into the US. I'm possibly going to be hit with a higher duty rate going into the US, and I'm possibly going to be hit with a import rate from Europe. So at least being in a position where you know the impact of that on your business is now the critical thing. We've seen stockpiling. If you see the CSO statistics, and I would do a kind of a monthly summary for the papers on those, you'll have seen the increase in exports of Irish products to the US as people, particularly in the January to March period, stockpiled in advance of the April tariffs. We've got a trade diversion taking place where companies look to new markets and look to access new markets. And again, in that situation, what we're saying is, if you want to extend your reach in terms of your sales or your purchases, it takes time to do that, as everybody will know. So use this time to identify new customers, identify new suppliers, and build those along with your US profile. Supply chain disruption, I think, has been on the cards for the last 10 years, almost at this stage, between Brexit and COVID and now this. So always have backups in terms, if you can, if at all possible, in terms of your critical raw materials. So as I said, what is the impact right now? What do you need to do? Take advantage of the pause phase. It won't do any harm. And to be perfectly honest, even doing all this work, and if everything works out, these are all important. This is important information to have. So it's something that should be there in your business. It's valuable information for your business. So work on it now. Implement strategic planning for your exports and imports. And I'm going to go through some of the, I suppose, the best, not the best, but at least the most manageable, probably duty savings opportunities. In those duty savings opportunities, you're looking at your building blocks. What's your tariff classification? What's the origin of your goods? What's the value of your goods? And then once you've determined those, also, is there temporary import procedures? So are you exporting to the US for manufacturing and re-export over temporary storage and re-export? If so, there's temporary import procedures that you can take advantage of. Similarly, with Europe, are you importing from the US into Europe for manufacturing and re-export? Again, there are tariff advantages and temporary import procedures that you can take advantage of. If you had not been paying duty or have been paying minimal duty, either way, you're not really, you haven't really looked at these temporary import procedures to date, because they probably wouldn't have been cost effective for implementation. But that's all going to change now. And so it's important to identify, well, what would the cost savings be if you were to put these procedures in place. So now let's get into a little bit of the detail and start drilling down. What practical steps do we recommend at the moment? The first thing is to know your supply chain. And I know that sounds straightforward, but it can sometimes be quite complex. And if you look at your end-to-end supply chain from your purchase to your sale, do you know where you purchase from? And everybody will say, of course, you know our suppliers, of course, you know our customers. But depending on the complexity of the business, that might be separated out into different departments. So you might need a team in place just to identify, and if you were impacted by Brexit, you would have seen the same approach. Put a team together. Where do I purchase from? What's the duty rate I pay? Of that, what is US origin? What is those US origin products on my list, on my European retaliatory list? If I was hit by 10% or 25% duty, how would that impact? Do the same in reverse. I'm selling to the US. If I'm hit with a 10%, 20%, 25% duty, how will that impact on my costs? Will I be able to absorb those costs? Will I have to pass them on to the customer? Will the customer accept them? I saw in the papers today that some of the aircraft engine manufacturers have advised their customers that they will be adding those prices into in as tariffs onto their contracts. And that brings me into the second point, to look at your contract terms. And again, we see this often. If you have a long-standing customer relationship, or supplier relationship. Those contracts could have been put in place years ago. Maybe they're not renewed annually. Maybe they're emails. What do they actually say? Who is the importer in those situations? Who's liable for the duties? Are you compliant with the terms that you've agreed, or is it just being convenient for one or other party to act as importer? So look and see, are you selling on an ex works basis so that your customer is actually the importer? Are you selling on a DDP basis so you're the importer? And if so, does your contract allow you to pass on any of those additional costs and those additional tariff costs? Have they been included in the wording? And if they haven't, is it something you can now start bringing up with your customers? A lot of others will do, and there'll be a sensitivity towards that, but that we're seeing that happen more and more. Similarly, if you're purchasing, you want to take the opposite approach. What is the agreement you've made with your suppliers? Are they responsible for the import duties? Are you responsible? Who's acting as importer? You might be acting as importer because you're a European-based entity and it's just easier for you to do so. Do you want to continue to do that? So really work through those contracts and look at what you've agreed and where you can, what is your options in terms of passing on some of those responsibilities to either customers or suppliers. In that context, you're going to need to look at your competitors. Is there price sensitivities? Is it something that you just have to absorb? If so, how do you manage that? You're going to need to talk to your accountants. Are there options for exemptions? That's what I was saying earlier about the European list. That's still open to June the 10th. So if you're currently on that list as identified as something that, so if you're currently on the list as something that is identified as something that's going to be imported, then start making representations, either direct or through Bord Bia or through Enterprise Ireland. Are there opportunities? Then you're looking to see, okay, what about alternative markets? What about the EU trade agreements that have been agreed? So we'll take a look at those agreements at the moment, and I'll show you where to find them. And they enable a European originating product to enter those markets for the most part at 0%. That's when you start getting into your real kind of now from drilling down into the next level of detail. Understand your tariff classifications, your origins, and your values. For the tariff classifications, that's going to be the first critical element. Everybody who's importer and exporter probably should know their tariff classifications. They need to be included on all customs entry documents, but make sure they're accurate, because that could determine whether you're on a list for tariff impact or you're not on the list. And if it's vague, this is also sometimes, particularly for newly developed products, if it's not clear if you're on the list or not on the list, can you get a classification decision that determines that you're not on the list? So start with that, as you know, into your technical details, start with your tariff classifications. Identify all your products that you import and you export. Ensure that the correct tariff classification is allocated to those products. Then look at the origin of your products. The origin for customs purposes is not where the goods were shipped from. It's where the goods originate, or where the last substantial processing took place that results in a new and different article. So let's say, for example, we have a lot of companies in Ireland who might be importing raw materials from China and manufacturing or assembling here. Does the level of manufacturing or assembly give European origin, or do you still retain Chinese origin, or any other country that you might purchase from? So just because you manufacture in Ireland doesn't mean those goods qualify as originating in Ireland. For the most part, rule of thumb would be that yes, that would be the most logical, but there are specific rules around that. So you do need to delve into the origin of your goods. Similarly, again, importing from the US. Are they US originating, or did they just transit through the US? Or was the key component manufactured elsewhere? Or was it a minor assembly took place in the US? Maybe they aren't going to be subject to the US tariffs. Then you want to look at the value. What value are you declaring to customs? The value is going to be the value of the goods that you buy, and that's what the duty rate is based on. In third-party transactions, then it's typically the invoice price. But if you're selling or buying intercompany, then the price may be potentially adjustable. Again, you have to work with your tax people on this to make sure that it's compliant from a corporate tax basis. But you can unbundle certain things from the value for customs. And one really valuable planning option here, which I'll talk about again in a second, is a thing called per sale, which we don't have in Europe, whereby the US will accept an earlier sale as the value for customs purposes in very specifically controlled circumstances. So look at that. That can be very beneficial in terms of reducing your duty costs. And then understand and look at the European free trade agreements. So let's go down another level into some duty minimization strategies. So you're exporting to the US. The EU currently has 958 billion of exports to the US, so a significant market and a lot for Irish food companies. Currently dutiable at 10%. And as I said, under negotiation. But one of the difficulties in those negotiations is going to be European food standards here, and the ability of the American manufacturers to access the European market due to those standards. And anybody, again, impacted by Brexit would have seen how the USPS checks have been quite difficult for to comply with. There's a lot of controls and checks on importing food products into the EU. So the first thing on importing into the US is make sure you have a broker. It's very difficult to import into the US without a licensed customs broker. It's very regulated business. And if you are the importer as opposed to your customer, you probably will have a broker, but just obviously critical to ensure that you have a good broker who's advising you on this. They will lodge the customs entry. There'll be a requirement for bonds. You have to pay your customs duties. And then if you incorrectly put down your classification, your origin, your value, any of these items, then you're subject to fines and penalties. So as I said at the beginning, if you have a customs broker lodging customs declarations for you, make sure you're in contact with them and you're gathering all of your import declarations that have been made to date, just in the event there's a potential for a refund. In terms of duty savings opportunities, there's a thing called American goods returned. So if your products were originally, if part of your product contains US content, or you have American products which are being returned to the US, then it's possible in certain situations to that they will not be subject to the customs duties. Now, you'll obviously have to have strong proof of origin in that situation, and you'll also need to be able to confirm whether those goods were enhanced or not enhanced. Are they being returned in their current state? Are they being returned after further manufacturing? How will you prove that to US Customs? Not a lot of guidance out there on this at the moment. So it's a little bit of a sense check to try and work through each product and say, okay, how do I prove this to customs? But you do need to be able to prove it. Ideally, an export declaration, the original export declaration. But if you don't have that, then you're looking at some alternative methods. If the US origin products return to the US, there's no time limit for return. If they are products that were in the US and paid duty and then came out, you've got 3 years. So looking at your US content in your products that you're selling back to the US and shipping back to the US, again, very worthwhile because that value can be reduced from the value for customs purposes. You can also have what's called duty drawback. So again, if you ship into the US for manufacturing and re-export, you can reclaim the duty paid on those imports up to about 90% of the value of the duty paid. So first sale, really, really critical. And this is a kind of very high level visualization. If you are a company, you're an Irish company, you're manufacturing here, which you're selling to the States, or you're purchasing from a subcontractor, and what you're purchasing is going directly to the US, clearly identified as going to the US, then in those situations, it can be possible to go back to that original sale as the value for customs purposes. This needs to have a lot of detail and file behind it. Customs will challenge it. But if you've done the work and you comply with all the conditions, of which there are quite a lot, it can be very worthwhile. So what we suggest in this case is, again, to look at your supply chain, look at what you're purchasing. Are those goods being purchased for direct export to the US? If so, if you were to base duty on that value, what would the value be? Is there a value then in going further to actually put together a file and try and argue this case with customs? And then, as I said, the temporary import procedures, foreign trade zones and bonded warehouses. They haven't been huge in the US as such, but again, worth asking if you're sending goods to a customer who's using them for further manufacture, are they in a free trade zone? Are they in a bonded warehouse? Can you take advantage of that? If you know that those goods are going in for manufacturing re-export, those procedures might be in place. So getting onto your customers and asking them what their plans are in relation to the current tariffs, or how they're actually managing them, and do they have these foreign trade zones or bond warehouses in place, can be worthwhile. So this is all going back to the moment you're just checking everything, you're checking the supply chain, you're checking what's in place to see what you can do. Then you're going into the European side of the planning. And I've put a list here of some of the 14th of April list. That said there's sugar, vegetable, beverages, wheat, prepared foods obtained from swelling or roasting of cereals. These are all currently on the list of retaliatory tariffs that will come in on 9th of July if the trade agreement or the trade negotiations are not successful. So as I said earlier, confirm your tariff classification, check, are you on this list? Secondly, again, check your tariff classification, are you on the list of possible countermeasures that are in from 8th of May? If so, step one, put in your position to the EU and argue why they shouldn't be on the list. Maybe they're not available in Europe, maybe you can only get them from the States. And secondly, if there's still a risk, again, your tariff classification, your product, is it there? And how is that going to be impacted by a 10, 20, 25% charge? If you are, again, so you've identified your product classification, you've identified if you're on the list. Let's say you confirmed you are on the list. Are you importing for sale in Europe, in which case that duty will be payable? Or are you importing to do some other kind of work or assembly or manufacturing or storage even, and re-export, in which case you want to put a customs temporary import procedure in place, such as customs warehousing or inward processing, and avoid paying the duty, because then it can be written off on re-export. Again, this is all about the supply chain. And there, as I said, is you're looking at your inward processing procedure. Inward processing, and these will take about 3 months to put in place, and that's why it's really important now to identify if these are of value and to get the information together for those applications, because they're complicated applications to make and a lot of detail needs. It generally takes about 4 to 6 weeks at least to actually pull that application together. It's going to take another 3 months going through the revenue commissioners. So these are not quick solutions. However, if you are ready to make an application, for example, for inward processing on the 9th of July, should you need to do that, then your authorization can be backdated to the 9th of July. You can request that in your application. So as long as you're ready to go, you can put in that application, request that it's backdated to 9th of July. It'll take 3 months to go through the revenue system, but you'll get any duties paid back. So inward processing allows businesses to import your non-EU goods, do your manufacturing here, and re-export with the duty being written off. If you do sell onto the EU market, then the duty becomes liable at that stage. Customs warehousing allows you to import goods, store those goods, and then re-export, duty written off. But if you put them on the EU market, duty is due at that stage. And temporary import, a little bit probably not as usable, but in certain circumstances, you can import goods for a temporary period if you're going to use them here temporarily, again, for re-export. So again, you're looking at saying, I'm doing manufacturing, but I'm not selling all my goods in Europe. Can I put this procedure in place? And then you want to look at the EU trade agreements. These are up on the EU trade website with a list of what's in place, what's ongoing for negotiation, what's being ratified, what's on hold. So you can identify from the map where there might be alternative customer options in terms of supplying to new customers or buying from new suppliers. So the Canadian agreement in particular is what I keep mentioning because of the fact we've seen on the news a lot of American goods being removed from the shelves in Canada. There is a market displacement going on there. It's a first mover advantage for anybody getting in to sell their goods as a replacement. So that's really very fast walk through, but what in terms of takeaways, what again, just to circle back, if you're a company in Ireland now affected by the US rates going into the US or potentially EU rates coming into Europe, I said, know your supply chain, really important. That's the basic step. Look at your purchases, your imports, your sales, your exports, and what manufacturing you're doing for re-export. Complete a risk analysis. What's the impact of 10, 20, 25% on your costs? Check your contract terms. Really go back into those files and find those contracts and dig into what have you said in there, and what is there any option if costs increase for prices to increase. Lobby where possible. We still have the consultation process set up until 10th of June. Are there opportunities in terms of the new trade or the trade agreements that are being negotiated, the trade agreements that exist? What about markets where there's displacement? As said, the Canadian ones only see most visibly on the news. Get into the detail of your customs. What your classifications, what your origin, what your value of all those products that you're buying and selling. Review your tax and transfer pricing strategies for intercompany sales, and keep up to date with the geopolitical changes. Now that can be really hard to do because they seem to be changing every day at the moment. I wake up every morning with what's happened last night. But if anybody has an interest in that kind of global trade and supply chain changes that are taking place in almost every country in the world, we do and video produce a quarterly update. I'm happy to send it on to anybody who'd like a copy. And then what I'd say is these 2 slides are the takeaways. Go through the tick the box. Next step for exporters, next step for importers. Next step for exporters, just tick it. Do you know the supply chain? What's the cost? What's your contract terms? Who are your competitors? What's your classification? What's your origin? What's your value? Are there opportunities for exemptions? Have you looked at other markets? Tick them off one by one. Do the same with your imports. Know your supply chain. Assess your imports against the list. Lobby. Assess your impact of the 25%, 10, 20. Check your contract terms. Can you get your goods from EU FTA suppliers as opposed to the US if needed? Understand the classifications, understand the origin, understand the value. Are there duty for savings procedures? Literally have these 2 up. I think if anybody who's heard me speak during the Brexit period, I would have said the same. Here's your 2 desktop sheets. Take your biro or take your mouse and tick off everything one by one. So when you get to the end, you know where you stand. So the aim is by 9th of July, you know where you stand in all of these areas and you're ready to move as needed. So essentially that concludes my overview of my recommendations, I guess, and where things stand at the moment. Jonathan, I know you were going to send me a QR code, but I didn't get it in time to add it.
No, that's fine, Carol. We'll cover those at the end. So thank you very much, Carol. There's a lot of information in there. We will be recording the session and pressing it down, and we're going to pick out 1 or 2 things, I understand, from the slide deck, including those last 2 slides, the next steps or the key takeaways, and we'll post them up on our Enterprise Ireland Tariffs website with everything else that we have. Let's get into some of the questions.